In a small English town, there was once a church everyone trusted. Families gathered there every Sunday to confess, to pray, and to believe. But behind the sermons and smiles, something else lived beneath those stone floors. Something that watched, listened, waited. This is the story of a boy who learned that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they stand at the pulpit. Years later, he returns to Dewsbury, not for redemption, but for answers. And what he finds is worse than what he left behind. Because evil doesn't die in Dewsbury. It learns how to preach again. You're listening to Folk Fashion Studio. And this is The Vicar of Dewsbury, a true sleep horror story about faith, silence, and the cost of looking away. Subscribe before we begin. In this church, the walls still listen. I was 13 when I first lit a candle in St. Bartholomew's Church. The wax smelled faintly of honey, and the smoke curled toward the rafters, catching the thin light that bled through the stained glass. Father Ellis stood behind me, hands folded, watching. "Keep your wrist loose," he said, smiling. "The flame listens better that way." That was the sort of thing he said all the time, half teaching, half poetry. People loved him for it. He had a way of making the ordinary sound sacred and the sacred sound safe. To me, he was more than the vicar. He was the kind of man I wanted to become, calm, measured, always sure of what was right. Mum said helping him would keep me out of trouble, though there wasn't much trouble to find in Dewsbury. Mostly it was just drizzle, gossip, and people trying to get by. The church was different. When I was there, everything made sense. The pews stood in perfect rows, the bells obeyed the hour, and the words of the liturgy never changed. It felt like being inside a clock that ran on faith instead of gears. One Tuesday afternoon, I arrived early to prepare for evening prayer. The air was cool and smelled of polish and old wood. I liked those quiet moments. No choir, no congregation, just the soft echo of my shoes on the stone. I went down to the vestry to fetch the linens. That's when I noticed the door. It was tucked behind a rack of robes near the bottom of the stairs, painted the same dull white as the wall. I'd passed it hundreds of times, but this time it was ajar. A faint draught breathed through the gap. I crouched and looked closer. The steps beyond were carved into stone, vanishing into darkness. I thought I heard a soft drip echoing below. Just as I leaned in, a voice said my name. "Joseph." I turned so fast the taper nearly went out. Father Ellis stood at the top of the steps, his face half in shadow. "What are you doing down there?" "I was just getting the linens," I said. The door was open. He came down a few steps, still smiling. "Old buildings like to show off their secrets," he said. "But that's not a place for you. There's mould, dust, things that bite." He shut the door gently and locked it with a small brass key. Then he laid a hand on my shoulder. His fingers were warm, heavy. "Curiosity's a fine thing," he said. "Just make sure you keep it pointed upward, not down." I nodded, embarrassed. Later that evening, when I told Mum I'd stayed late to help polish the brass, she looked pleased. She liked hearing Father Ellis say I was a thoughtful boy. It made her proud, and I liked giving her that feeling. But when I went to bed, I couldn't stop thinking about the steps that led under the church. By autumn, I knew every corner of St. Bartholomew's. I knew which pew creaked, which hymn numbers people ignored, and which parishioners brought biscuits no one liked. But more than anything, I knew Father Ellis's voice. He spoke the way some people sing, measured, gentle, always landing on the right note. His sermons seemed to come from somewhere deep inside him. Everyone admired him for that. At first, so did I, until I started recognizing my own words in them. Once he spoke about a young man who fears disappointing his mother. The week before, I'd told him those exact words in confession. Another time, he mentioned a boy who lies awake wondering if he'll ever be good enough. I'd said that too, only to him, behind a curtain, believing it was private. The congregation nodded, moved. I sat there frozen, my stomach twisting. I told myself it must have been coincidence. My fears weren't unique, but then little details crept in, phrases I'd never heard anyone else say. Each one felt like a thread being pulled out of my chest in front of everyone. After Mass, people would shake his hand, thanking him for another beautiful sermon. He'd smile modestly, bow his head, murmur, "It's not me speaking." But I wasn't so sure anymore. There was a woman named Mrs. K who came every Sunday. She always wore gloves and sat near the front. I sometimes carried hymn books for her, and she'd pat my arm and say, "Such a polite young man." One Thursday she asked if I could help her move some flowers into the vestry. We set the box down beside the safe. She hesitated, then said, "Tell Father I won't be at service this week. Nothing serious, just time away." I promised I would. That Sunday, her seat was empty. A week later, one of the wardens said she'd gone to stay with her daughter in Leeds. Then her name disappeared from the flower rota. During that same period, Father Ellis gave a sermon about a faithful woman who sought refuge elsewhere. People wept. He never said her name, but everyone seemed to know. Everyone except me. The church ran a safeguarding meeting in September. I didn't know what that meant, only that I was told to stack chairs while the adults talked. The woman leading it, Mrs. Grant, had short hair and a sharp voice. "Boundaries keep people safe," she said. "No secrets between adults and children. No private meetings, no closed doors." Some of the wardens chuckled. One said, "Soon we won't even be able to pat a kid on the head." Mrs. Grant didn't laugh. "If it stops someone getting hurt, then good." Father Ellis smiled from the back row. "Safety is just another word for faith," he said, and everyone nodded. Afterward, I saw him talking to Mrs. Grant in low tones. She smiled, handed him a pamphlet and left. He watched her go, then turned and caught me looking. "All rules, no trust," he said softly, with a half-smile. "It's a sad world, Joseph. Don't let it make you cynical." "I won't," I said automatically. But I didn't like how his smile lingered. That autumn, the rain barely stopped. Buckets lined the side chapel to catch the drips. Everything smelled of damp stone and extinguished candles. I still served faithfully. I still called him Father and meant it. But I'd begun to notice things, how often he locked the vestry door, how the churchwardens deferred to him like frightened pupils, how parishioners who fell out with him seemed to simply stop coming. Once, after choir practice, he asked me to help carry hymnals downstairs. We stacked them neatly on a table. The light was dim, gold from a single lamp. He rested against the wall, arms folded. "You're a good lad," he said, "dependable. Do you know how rare that is?" I shook my head, blushing. He smiled. "I see you trying to be perfect. That's not what God asks for, just loyalty." Then he put his hand on my shoulder, gentle, heavy, and said, "Loyalty matters more than rules." When I got home that night, I wrote those words in my notebook. I didn't know why. I just didn't want to forget them. By November, I'd developed the habit of listening at doors. I told myself it was curiosity, not suspicion. One evening after Vespers, I returned to fetch my bag and heard a faint sound from the vestry, whispering. I stopped outside and listened. It was him, praying, I thought. But then I realized it wasn't Latin or English. It was just his voice, low and rhythmic, repeating something like a hum. When I peeked through the crack, I saw him kneeling before the undercroft door. The lamp cast his shadow long and crooked on the wall. He pressed his forehead to the wood. I stepped back quickly, heart hammering. He stood a moment later, turned the key and straightened. "Joseph," he said, calm as ever. "Still here?" "Sorry, Father, I forgot my bag." He nodded. "Churches hold many echoes, some best left to fade." I didn't answer. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing him kneeling before that door, whispering to the dark. The next day, during class, I caught myself writing the word Undercroft over and over in the margin of my notebook. At home, I asked Mum if she believed priests ever had secrets. She gave me a tired smile. "Everyone does, love. That's why we have confession." The first Sunday of Advent, the church was packed. The candles glowed like tiny suns, and the choir sang until the air trembled. I should have felt comforted, but I didn't. The sermon that morning was about obedience. Obedience, Father Ellis said, isn't submission. It's trust. We obey those who guide us because we know they act in love. He looked at me when he said it, or maybe I imagined that. After the service, as I was extinguishing candles, he came up behind me. "You're learning well," he said softly. "You understand things others don't." I didn't reply. I just stared at the last candle flickering, its smoke curling toward the ceiling. He laid a hand on my shoulder again. "Keep serving, Joseph. It's what you're meant for." That night I dreamed of the Undercroft, the locked door breathing, as if something behind it were listening. When I woke, the smell of candle smoke still lingered in my hair. For the first time since I joined St. Bartholomew's, I didn't want to go back. After the first Sunday of Advent, I began keeping proper notes, not just thoughts or feelings, but facts. I'd seen enough detective shows to know that details mattered more than suspicions, so I started recording everything. Times, dates, what people said, what they didn't. December 3rd, Mrs. K absent for third week. December 4th, hairdresser says the Vicar sorted it. December 5th, Undercroft door locked again. Key sound after compline. Writing it down made things sharper. I wasn't imagining them. On Tuesday evening, I went back to the church under the excuse that I'd forgotten my gloves. It was already dark. The stained glass looked like bruises against the sky. The main doors were unlocked, which was strange. Father Ellis was careful about that. Inside, the air was still and heavy with incense. I could hear faint shuffling from the vestry, then the sound of a latch. I froze near the choir stalls. A soft thud followed, then silence. When I stepped into the vestry, no one was there. The lamp on his desk was on, casting yellow light across stacks of envelopes. The Undercroft door was shut, but not locked. I could tell because the keyhole glinted faintly. No key inside. I hesitated. Then I pressed the handle. It turned easily. Cold air drifted up, stale and wet like extinguished candles and old plaster. My phone torch cut through the dark, revealing the narrow stone steps. The deeper I went, the colder it grew, as though I'd stepped into a cellar that had forgotten sunlight existed. At the bottom was a small corridor, barely 5 feet wide. The walls were marked with chalk, long white lines that ran across the floor and up the sides, meeting in careful squares. Inside one square, someone had written visitors and rubbed it out so hard the chalk had smeared. Boxes of candles and old hymnals were stacked in a corner. A metal table leaned against the wall, its legs bound with twine. On the floor sat a cracked bottle of surgical spirit, half empty. The smell made my throat tighten. Nothing about it was mystical or dramatic. It was too ordinary, and that was worse. It looked like a place meant for practical things that had slowly turned secret. I turned to go back up when I heard footsteps above me, slow, deliberate, crossing the vestry floor. I killed the torch and pressed myself against the wall. The footsteps stopped right above the stairs. Then the door creaked open, and a strip of light widened across the floor. Father Ellis stood there. I saw only his shoes and the hem of his cassock. He didn't move for a long time. Then he said quietly, "Mercy." Just that one word. Not as a prayer, as if he were speaking to someone down here. He closed the door and turned the key. The silence that followed was thick enough to breathe. I counted to 60 before daring to move. My legs were shaking by the time I reached the top. The lock clicked easily from the inside. The key had only held from his side. I stepped out, closed it gently, and fled. I didn't stop running until I was halfway home. That night I wrote 3 pages. The words came out fast, uneven. He knows I saw. He said mercy. He said it like an answer. The next day I decided to find Mrs. K myself. Her flat was above a hairdresser's on Thornfield Road. The door buzzer still had her name on it, M.K. I pressed it. No answer. A woman sweeping up hair inside the salon came out and frowned at me. "You looking for Margaret?" "Yes, from church." "She's gone," she said. "The vicar sorted it, packed her things himself." I didn't like how she said it, not angry, just final, like something you shouldn't ask about again. I thanked her and walked home. The word sorted stuck with me. It could mean anything. By Thursday, I decided to talk to someone else. On the notice board near the church door, there was a new sheet pinned up after the safeguarding meeting. Safeguarding lead, Mrs. Steele, with a phone number below. I'd seen her once. She ran the second-hand bookshop near the bus station. I went after school, notebook in my pocket. The shop smelled of dust and tea leaves. She looked up from behind the counter, glasses perched on her head. "You're one of the altar boys, aren't you?" "Yes, Joseph." "Ah, the vicar's right hand." She smiled faintly. "What can I do for you?" I swallowed. "I'm worried about something at church." Her smile faded. "All right, start simple. What happened?" I told her about Mrs. K disappearing, about the sermons that echoed things I'd said in confession, about hearing him in the Undercroft. I left out the part about going down there myself. She listened without interrupting, just nodding occasionally, her fingers steepled under her chin. When I finished, she said, "Do you believe he's done something wrong?" "I don't know. Maybe. I just think things don't add up." She stood and poured 2 mugs of tea. Sometimes churches hide behind politeness, she said. It's easier to keep smiling than to ask why something smells off. Will you tell someone? I'll make some inquiries, she said carefully. And you'll do nothing for now. Don't go back alone. Don't mention this to him. And if anything happens that makes you feel unsafe, ring that number on the poster. Any hour. I nodded. As I was leaving, she said, "One more thing, Joseph. When people in power say mercy, they usually mean silence." Friday after school, I walked past the church again. The winter light was fading, and the tower's shadow stretched across the graveyard. I saw someone standing by the side gate, Mr. Laughton, one of the wardens, smoking. He gave me a nod. "Evening, lad. You're not in there helping tonight?" "No, sir." He blew smoke into the air. "You tell your mother the vicar's a good man. A lot of talk lately, none of it helpful." "What sort of talk?" "Just talk," he said, flicking his ash. "Best leave men of God to their work." I walked away before he could see my face. That Sunday, the church felt wrong. I can't explain it better than that. People still smiled, still shook hands at the peace, but their smiles didn't reach their eyes. The sermon was about truth. Truth, Father Ellis said, isn't the same as fact. Facts change, truth endures. He looked directly at me when he said it. My hands were sweating. The sound of the organ behind him became a low, pulsing hum. After the service, I lingered near the vestry. I could hear him talking inside to someone, maybe Mr. Laughton. Their voices were too soft to catch words, only tone. Firm, measured, then a low laugh. On the desk sat a neat pile of envelopes, sealed with stickers showing a lamb across a man's shoulders. One was addressed to Mrs. M.K., so St. Bartholomew's. Without thinking, I slid it halfway out from the stack. It was thicker than a letter. I caught the faint smell of candle wax and spirit. A voice said, "Something you need, Joseph." I spun around. He stood in the doorway, coat half-buttoned, scarf loose around his neck. His expression was mild, patient. I was just tidying up," I stammered. He walked over, eyes on the letters. "You're a good helper. Reliable." He adjusted the stack slightly, tapping them straight. "Reliability is a blessing." "Yes, Father." He smiled faintly. "Though sometimes being too curious can lead you to places you don't belong." I couldn't speak. He picked up one of the envelopes and turned it in his hand. "You'll learn," he said softly, "that the church remembers everything. Every confession, every kindness, every sin. The walls keep their own gospel." Then he tucked the envelope into his coat pocket and left. That night I wrote until my pen ran dry. He knows I know. He watches. The church keeps its own gospel. I didn't go to the police. I didn't even call Mrs. Steele. I didn't know what I'd be reporting. My vicar says strange things isn't much of a case, but I started avoiding him, staying home, feigning colds, claiming schoolwork. Mum noticed. "You're not sick of church, are you?" She asked one evening over dinner. "I just need a break," she smiled. "You've been working hard. Even saints need rest." I almost laughed at that. That night I dreamt of chalk lines stretching down stone corridors and a voice saying mercy again and again, softer each time, until it became my own. When I woke, my notebook was open on the desk beside me. A draft from the window had turned the pages, and the words I'd written last were the only ones visible. What the walls remember. And I realized what frightened me most wasn't what I'd seen. It was what I hadn't. Because if the walls remembered, then maybe everyone else had chosen to forget. After that Sunday, I started seeing patterns everywhere. Not signs from God, just the small human kind. Repeated phrases, quiet exchanges, faces turning away when they used to smile. The vicar's sermons grew stranger. They weren't about scripture anymore, not really. They were about obedience. When a community trusts its shepherd, he said, it doesn't scatter when the wolves come. People nodded, as if afraid to be the first not to. I watched the congregation more than I watched him. They still adored him, but it wasn't the same adoration. It was a tired kind, one built on habit. Mrs. Steele called me the following week. "I've spoken with the wardens," she said. Her voice was careful. "They say everything's in order." "What about Mrs. K?" I asked. "They told me she's fine. She's being cared for." "Cared for where?" "I wasn't given details," she said quietly. "You should stay focused on school, Joseph. Leave the church to the adults." Her tone wasn't cruel, just resigned. Like she'd tried something once and it hadn't worked. That night I wrote, "Even the people meant to listen have learned not to." It was around that time the vicar started asking me to help after hours. Only little things, he said. Administrative chores. You're a trustworthy lad. He'd call it helping with church business, but it always happened when no one else was around. One evening I arrived to find him sitting at his desk with the yellow lamp burning. The room smelled faintly of polish and something sour beneath it, like fruit gone bad. "Ah, Joseph," he said, "come in." There were papers everywhere, letters, invoices, envelopes. He gestured to a small pile. "Could you file these for me? Alphabetically in that cabinet." I did as told. As I worked, I saw some of the letterheads. Pastoral Care Office, Diocesan Outreach, Parish Relief Fund. Some envelopes had no stamps. A few were unsealed. He watched me in silence for a while, for a pen resting between his fingers. Then he said, "You're thorough. I like that. Thank you, Father. You remind me of myself at your age." I smiled politely, unsure what that meant. He stood and walked behind me, slow and deliberate. I could feel his breath on my neck when he leaned to look at the drawer. "Order is godliness," he said softly. "A tidy world leaves no room for suspicion." I pretended to focus on the papers. He straightened, patted my shoulder, and walked to the window. "You've heard people talk, haven't you?" My throat went dry. "Talk about what?" "About me." I hesitated. "Only good things." He chuckled, low and humorless. "Good things can be twisted, Joseph. People are frightened of what they can't name, especially when it's wearing a collar." He turned from the window and smiled. "That's why I trust you. You see truth where others see gossip." I nodded, because that was what he wanted. But inside, something shifted. The way he said trust sounded like ownership. Later that week, I tried to talk to Mum. We were having tea, cheap instant stuff that always smelled stronger than it tasted. She was tired, rubbing her temples the way she did after long shifts. "Mum," I said, "if someone at church was lying, who would you tell?" She frowned. "What sort of lying?" "I don't know, pretending to be good." She smiled faintly. "That's most of us, isn't it?" "No, I mean, if someone was using it, the church, I mean, to do bad things." Her face changed slightly. "Is this about Father Ellis?" I froze. "Why?" "Because you've gone quiet every time his name comes up. He's been good to us, Joe. He's the reason we kept going after your dad left. Don't start seeing monsters where there aren't any." I wanted to tell her everything, but I couldn't. The words sounded absurd even in my head, so I just said, "I think something's wrong." She sighed. "You're a good boy. You see wrong everywhere because you want the world to be clean, but some things are just messy. Don't get yourself in trouble trying to tidy them." I went to my room and wrote, "Mum believes in the story more than the man." The following Saturday, the vicar asked me to meet him early to prepare for Sunday's Advent service. I thought about saying no, but he had a way of making refusal feel like sin. The church was silent when I arrived. The air was cold enough to bite. He was already in the vestry, sleeves rolled, cassock draped on a hanger. "Ah, good lad," he said. "There's something heavy in the undercroft, an old lectern. We're clearing space for the nativity scene. Give me a hand." I froze. "The undercroft?" He smiled. "It's just storage. You've no reason to be afraid of stone and dust." Before I could answer, he'd unlocked the door. The smell hit first, cold earth and candle grease. He motioned for me to go first. I went down, phone light trembling in my hand. The chalk lines were still there, fainter now. He followed, the sound of his shoes steady behind me. "There," he said, pointing to a wooden stand leaning against the wall. "That's it. Help me lift." I bent to grab one end. As I did, my torch caught something on the floor beside the stand, a small square of paper half covered by dust. I picked it up before he could see. It was an old church leaflet. Pastoral Care Outreach. Confidential support for parishioners in crisis. But someone had written a name in the corner. M.K. My pulse jumped. I slid it into my pocket. We carried the lectern up the stairs. My arms ached, but I barely felt it. When we reached the top, he said, "Good work, you're getting stronger." He locked the door again, pocketed the key, and clapped me on the shoulder. "You see? Nothing to fear in the dark." I forced a smile. "No, Father." But I could feel the paper pressing against my leg the whole walk home. That night I examined it under my lamp. The writing was in pencil, faint but neat. On the back, someone had scribbled a phone number, then crossed it out. I dialed it anyway. It rang 3 times before a voice answered. "Hello?" A woman, uncertain. I said, "Is this Mrs. K?" Silence. Then, "Who's asking?" I'm Joseph, from St. Bartholomew's. I used to help with the altar. Another pause. You shouldn't be calling me. Are you all right? The line crackled. He said you'd ask. My heart dropped. Who? She didn't answer. There was a faint sound, maybe a door closing, then nothing but static. I called again. This time it went straight to voicemail. The next morning he greeted me like nothing had happened. His sermon was on repentance and renewal. Every word made my skin crawl. Afterward, he asked if I'd be free on Christmas Eve to help with the late service. I lied and said we were visiting family. He smiled, faintly amused. Of course, family first. That afternoon, I went back to Mrs. Steele's bookshop. She looked up from the counter, startled. I spoke to her, I said quietly. Mrs. K, she's alive. Her eyes widened. You're sure? I called the number written on a leaflet from the Undercroft. I handed her the paper. She studied it for a long time. You shouldn't have gone down there. I know, but someone has to. She folded the leaflet carefully. Leave this with me. What will you do? Follow it. Quietly. These things take time. Time for what? For people to believe. By Christmas, I stopped going to church altogether. Mum thought it was teenage rebellion. You'll come round, she said. He's been asking after you. That frightened me more than anything. On Christmas Eve, I walked past the church on my way home. Candles glowed through the stained glass, and the sound of carols drifted into the cold air. Outside the vestry window, I saw him alone, straightening papers, humming softly. He looked peaceful, kind, holy, and then he turned toward the window. His eyes met mine through the glass. He didn't frown, didn't startle, just smiled that same gentle smile, the one everyone trusted, the one I finally knew wasn't kindness at all. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing his face behind the glass. The faint reflection of the candlelight on the panes made it look like he was surrounded by flames. I opened my notebook, ready to write it down, but instead I drew the outline of the church, the vestry, the Undercroft below. I labelled everything like a map. When I finished, I stared at the title I'd written across the top, The Weight of the Cassock, because it wasn't the robe itself that was heavy, it was what he carried inside it, and what everyone else refused to see. After Christmas, the church felt colder. Not from weather, but from eyes that looked and didn't see. People still smiled, but their smiles were shorter. The wardens spoke softly around me. Even the choir boys avoided jokes. It was as if someone had told them I'd done something wrong, though no one could say what. I stopped helping after hours. Mum thought I was just tired. You've been doing too much for a boy your age, she said. Take a break. But it wasn't rest I needed. It was distance. Still, the vicar found ways to keep me near. He sent notes home, polite invitations written in that looping script of his. Would Joseph care to assist with Advent preparations? Would Joseph like to help with the youth choir? Each one folded neatly, signed, Yours in faith, F. Ellis. I didn't answer any of them. Then, one evening, a white envelope arrived addressed to Mum. Inside was a letter printed on church paper. Open quote, Dear Mrs. P, we're concerned about Joseph's well-being. Please join us for a brief meeting regarding his continued involvement in parish activities. In Christ, the parish safeguarding team, close quote. Mum read it twice. Why are they worried about you? I don't know, I said. Maybe because I stopped going. Well, we'll sort it, she said, smoothing the letter flat. They're good people. The meeting took place in the church hall on a damp January night. The lights buzzed faintly. There was tea, biscuits, and that same smell of cleaning fluid that always clung to church floors. At the table sat 3 people. Mrs. Steele, looking uneasy, Mr. Lofton, one of the wardens, and Father Ellis at the head, smiling like a patient teacher. Thank you for coming, he said warmly. We're simply concerned. Joseph's been such a help to the parish, we'd hate to see him withdraw. Mum nodded, already soothed by his tone. He's a good boy, just a bit tired. That's all I suspected, he said. Sometimes sensitive souls feel burdened by the world's noise. He looked at me, eyes gentle, and by whispers. I didn't speak. Mrs. Steele cleared her throat. Joseph, if you ever feel uncomfortable, you can speak to me. I tried, I said quietly. Her mouth tightened, but she said nothing. The warden shifted in his seat. We're all on the same side here, he said. I almost laughed. After the meeting, Mum apologized to them. He's just imaginative, she said. He means no harm. Outside, she scolded me for being rude. You embarrassed me. He's worried about you, Joe. He's worried about being found out. What does that mean? I didn't answer. She wouldn't have believed me if I had. A few days later, Mrs. Steele called. He's leaving, she said. Health reasons. The diocese has approved early retirement. Just like that? Yes. No investigation. No statement. He'll be gone by spring. I should have felt relieved. Instead, I felt sick. Where's Mrs. K? I asked. I don't know. She hesitated. You were right about some things. But be careful, Joseph. They protect their own. After that, I started keeping everything in one folder. My notes, the leaflet with Mrs. K's name, the letter to Mum, the photo of the chalk lines in the undercroft. I wasn't sure what it all proved, but it felt like something real in a world that kept pretending nothing had happened. That Sunday, I went back. I told myself it was just to see, but curiosity felt too much like faith. The congregation was smaller. He stood at the pulpit in a lighter cassock, his voice softer than usual. Forgiveness, he said, is the heart's greatest test. We must forgive even those who accuse us wrongly, for they too are in pain. Some people nodded, others glanced my way. After the service, I slipped into the vestry. The undercroft door was open. Light spilled down the stairs. I froze. He was down there. I could hear the scrape of wood against stone. I crept to the edge and looked. He was kneeling before the wall, wiping something away with a damp cloth. When he stepped aside, I saw what it was. The chalk word visitors. Gone now, the dust smeared into grey streaks. He turned suddenly, looking up toward the stairs. Joseph? I ran. I didn't tell anyone. Not Mrs. Steele. Not Mum. Not even my notebook. I just packed a bag. That night, while Mum was asleep, I took my folder, some cash, and my phone and left through the back door. The air was brittle with frost. I walked fast, head down, until I reached the bus station. I wasn't sure where I was going, just not Dewsbury. I bought a ticket to Huddersfield, where my aunt lived. She wouldn't ask questions, not right away. The bus was half empty. I sat near the front, gripping my folder like a life jacket. The town slipped away behind me. The church tower, the crooked roofs, the glowing windows where nothing ever happened and everything did. I thought about how the vicar always said truth endures. He was right, but not in the way he meant. Truth endures like rot does. Quietly, deep in the beams where no one looks. At my aunt's, I finally told someone. Not everything, just enough. She believed me faster than I expected. You're safe here, she said. You did the right thing. The next morning, Mrs. Steele called again. He's gone, she said. The diocese confirmed it. Retired for health reasons. I waited for her to say more. Something about police, or victims, or justice. But she didn't. What about the letters, I asked. Locked in the office, she said. They'll be reviewed. Reviewed. Another word for buried. That afternoon, Mum called from Dewsbury. Her voice was small. They said you've been through a lot. They told me to give you space. Who told you that? The churchwarden. She hesitated. He said Father Ellis is resting somewhere quiet. He forgives you. Forgives me. I almost laughed, but it came out as a sob. A week later, a letter arrived at my aunt's house. No return address, but I knew the handwriting instantly. Open quote, Joseph, I hope you're finding peace. I hold no anger toward you. Some souls mistake pain for calling, suspicion for vigilance. That's not a sin, just youth. Remember, the church remembers all things, even mercy. F. Ellis. Close quote. I tore it in half, then in half again. But that night, I taped the pieces back together and slipped it into my folder. Because evidence, even when it sickens you, is still evidence. A few months passed. The parish sent a newsletter announcing a new vicar, Reverend Michael Hurst. There was a photo, younger, smiling, family man. The article read, open quote, We welcome Reverend Hurst to St. Bartholomew's following the faithful service of our beloved Father Ellis, now retired for health reasons. Close quote. I read it 3 times. The words were identical to every story I'd ever heard about anyone who'd vanished. I put the paper away and told myself it was over. But one night, unable to sleep, I opened my notebook. The pages smelled faintly of ink and damp. On the last line I'd written months ago, I added one more note. A parish that hears nothing is not the same as a parish with nothing to hear. A few weeks later, Mrs. Steele wrote one final time. Open quote, Joseph, I've moved on from the parish. They appointed a new safeguarding lead. I wanted you to know the file's been sent to the diocese. That's as far as it goes sometimes. Don't lose faith in the idea of truth, even if it's small. You were brave. Estiel, close quote. I didn't reply. Because bravery hadn't changed anything. The vicar was gone, yes, but in the kind of way that leaves his shadow behind. The same words, the same silences, the same polished smiles. It wasn't just him that scared me anymore. It was how easy it was for everyone else not to care. In April, Mum visited. She hugged me too tightly, cried into my jacket. They say he's resting abroad, she whispered. Somewhere sunny. I almost said I hope the sun burns him, but I didn't. She still needed to believe in grace. When she left, I went for a walk. I found myself near a small church, new to me, with open doors and music drifting out. Inside, people were singing softly, the same hymns, the same words, and I realized it would all happen again somewhere else. Maybe not with him, maybe not in Dewsbury, but the shape of it, the system, the silence would repeat. That was the real horror, not one man's sickness, but the quiet that made room for it. That night, I opened my folder one last time. Inside were all the small truths, notes, photos, letters, proof of what no one wanted proved. I didn't burn them. I didn't throw them away. I just sealed the folder in a plastic sleeve and tucked it into the back of my suitcase, because someday someone would ask why I left, and I wanted to have the evidence ready. It had been 10 years since I'd left Dewsbury. I built a small life in Leeds, a flat, a job, quiet evenings with the television low. I never talked about the church. People don't want stories that end without justice. Then Mum died. Heart failure. Her funeral was at St. Bartholomew's. She'd arranged it herself. The church that raised my son, she'd written. I told myself I'd sit in the back, stay polite, and leave before anyone noticed me. But when I stepped off the train, I already knew I'd go inside. The town looked the same, grey streets, the smell of rain and exhaust, but the church had been scrubbed clean. New windows, fresh paint, a sign by the gate, Reverend Michael Hurst, Vicar Safeguarding Lead, Mrs. Quinn. The words made me smile bitterly. They'd learned the right language now. Inside it was brighter, warmer, everything polished. But beneath it all, the same smell, candle wax, damp stone, something sweet and sour beneath the polish. I slipped into a back pew. The new vicar was young, handsome and confident. His voice filled the nave. Brothers and sisters, he said, forgiveness is not forgetting, it's remembering differently. Something about his tone snagged me. The rhythm, the pauses. It wasn't just familiar, it was rehearsed. He read from Luke, "For nothing is hidden that will not be made manifest." My stomach clenched. Ellis used to quote that, always with the same inflection. Then came the line that stopped me cold. When I was young, I believed silence was safety, that if we didn't name evil, it couldn't touch us. My throat tightened. Those were my words. Mine. I'd written them in my notebook when I was 13. Mrs. Steele had read them once and said I had a gift for reflection. Now they were part of his sermon. The congregation nodded, moved. He smiled softly. But silence isn't safety. It's permission. Applause. And I sat there, watching a man I'd never met preach my words, wearing the calm confidence of someone who'd inherited not just a parish, but a script. After the service, I waited near the door. When he saw me, he offered his hand. "Welcome, friend." "I used to serve here," I said. "Ah, then you know what a blessing this church can be." I knew Father Ellis. He hesitated, then smiled again. A complicated man. He did a great deal of good. "He also did harm," I said quietly. He didn't flinch. All men are imperfect, aren't they? What matters is what we build after. I looked past him to the vestry door, freshly painted, the brass handle gleaming. Next to it, the small undercroft door, still locked, still there. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing the word mercy, not from him, but from the past, whispered in the dark beneath stone. By morning I'd convinced myself to go back, just to see, to prove to myself that time really had changed something. The cleaner let me in, assuming I was staff. The church was empty and cold. I went straight to the vestry. The undercroft door stood ajar. I hesitated, then went down. The space had changed completely. Clean tiles, fluorescent lights, fresh plaster. No smell of earth. No chalk. No secrets. On one wall hung a plaque. Open quote, "Restored in memory of Reverend Francis Ellis, a shepherd to the end," close quote. My chest went hollow. They hadn't erased him. They'd sanctified him. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each labelled, safeguarding reports, parish records, confidential archives. I stared at them, unsure whether to laugh or scream. They'd turned the hiding place into an archive. Footsteps sounded on the stairs. I turned. The new vicar stood there, holding a folder. "I thought I might find you here," he said softly. "You used to serve, didn't you?" "Yes," I said. He descended a few steps. "It's strange, isn't it? How memory lingers in walls. We tidy, repaint, and still the air remembers." "What's in the folder?" "Your words," he said. "Your notes. They were part of the old inquiry files." He offered it to me. My handwriting showed through the plastic sleeve, the lines I'd written in fear all those years ago. "You read them?" "Of course," he said gently. "We use them in our safeguarding training now. You're an example of courage. The boy who spoke up." I shook my head. "You turned what happened into a lesson." "Isn't that what healing is?" "No," I said. "That's rewriting." He smiled. "History is rewriting. Faith just gives it better words." He placed the folder back on the shelf beside the plaque. "You should be proud. You helped this church grow." And then he left. I stood there alone, surrounded by the hum of the new lights. My words, my fear, now catalogued and repurposed. Through the open doorway, I saw sunlight cutting across the pews above, dust drifting like incense. For a moment, I almost believed it was beautiful. Then I noticed a new notice board by the stairs. Training Seminar, The Weight of Mercy, led by Reverend M. Hurst. I felt the room tilt. The Weight of Mercy. It was a title I'd written once, the last page of my notebook. They hadn't just stolen my words. They'd turned them into theology. I left without looking back. Outside, the bells were ringing. Families walked in, children holding hands. The world had moved on. At the train station cafe, I called Mrs. Steele. "I saw it," I said. "They've turned the Undercroft into a memorial. My notebook's there." "I know," she said softly. "They use your story in workshops. The parish that learned to listen. That's what they call it." "They never listened." "They never do," she said. "They just change the language. Makes the silence sound holy." I wanted to ask if she thought it would ever stop, but she'd already hung up. On the train back to Leeds, I pulled the last page from my folder, the note that read, "Truth endures like rot does." I folded it once, then again, and slipped it into my wallet. Because rot, at least, doesn't lie about what it is. As the train pulled away, I looked back toward the town. The church tower was still visible through the rain, faint and shining. Bells echoed faintly, the same pattern, the same rhythm. "Mercy upon us," the voices sang. The words carried over the fields, soft and familiar. And for the first time in years, I realized the truth. Evil doesn't die when you expose it. It adapts. It learns the language of healing, and when it speaks again, it sounds exactly like grace. You've been listening to The Vicar of Dewsbury, a folk fashion studio sleep horror story. If you're still awake, remember this. The scariest things don't live in nightmares. They live in the quiet places, the ones we trust the most. Subscribe to Folk Fashion Studio for more stories that whisper when the lights go out. New tales every week. Folklore, fear, and the kind of silence that never really ends. Until next time, sleep lightly.